Good evening. My name is Soyoung Lee. I'm an associate curator in the Department of Asian Art here at the Metropolitan Museum and a co-curator of the recently opened exhibition Poetry in Clay, Korean Buncheong ceramics from Leeum, Samsung Museum of Art. Thank you so much for coming tonight to spend part of Friday evening with me. The exhibition was first conceived about 5 years ago, so it's a project that's sort of long in the making, and I'm really excited that it's actually happened and here for 4 months, and that I can share these wonderful objects with you. Tonight's lecture sort of works around the exhibition itself, but tries to sort of delve a little bit deeper into some of the intriguing issues around the ceramics that are on display in the gallery, in the Arts of Korea gallery, on the second floor in the museum. The exhibition highlights a very distinctive group of ceramics known as Buncheong ware. And Buncheong is a modern term. It's short for Bunjang Hwaechong Sagi, which was coined in the 20th century by an art historian, a Korean art historian who in fact is considered the father of Korean art history. And it's a term that literally describes the physical properties, what the ceramics look like, basically gray-bodied stoneware with white slip decoration under a fairly clear glaze with a greenish tint. And Buncheong ware was produced primarily in the 15th and 16th centuries. And though it is quite unique in its appearance and extremely dynamic and distinctive, it didn't pop out of nowhere. In fact, Buncheong evolved from an existing earlier tradition of inlaid celadon. Many of you are, if you're familiar with Korean art, probably most familiar with celadon from the Kyoto period. And inlaid celadon, as many of you know, is one of those sort of very distinctively Korean genre of ceramics. Let's get to our first slide, if I can maneuver these buttons. And so the application of white slip, which is sort of the key to understanding Buncheong ware and is the key to one of the main physical qualities of Buncheong ware, in fact, derives from this earlier tradition of inlaid celadon. And I want to start with this particular object, which in fact is the first object that you begin in the gallery, because it's sort of the quintessential early Buncheong ware. This dates to the first half of the 15th century. And again, just to remind you, Buncheong ware starts in the end of the 14th century and has about a 200-year run and completely dies out by the second half of the 16th century. So this dates to the first half of the 15th century, and as you can see, the bottom half with the peony decoration, though it looks like it's painted, is in fact inlaid, which of course means that the motifs were individually carved and then filled with a white slip being basically a watered-down clay mixture. And then the top half with the rows of dots were decorated using stamps. So rather than hand carving, the potter took stamps, which allowed for much more efficient manufacture. And indeed, this is what happens. Though the inlay technique derives from, as I explained, inlaid celadon. One example of which you see on your left. Here, the lotus flower, the chrysanthemums, and all of these designs are inlaid. Every motif is individually hand-carved and filled with white slip, on top of which was applied a glaze with a trace amount of iron content, which gives it this green glaze. Then, toward the end of this, the 14th century, due to sort of changing political, social, and economic conditions, the potters have to change the kinds of wares that they're making. And one of the changes brought on was sort of greater mass production, shall we say, and more efficient means of producing these ceramics, hence the change from individual carving to stamping the design, which you already see, as exemplified on the example on the right, in the 14th century in celadon. And Buncheong sort of takes that to the next level. Let's see if I have an... At the same time that it is a descendant of an earlier tradition, that is of Koryo inlaid celadon, Buncheong in the 15th century is also in some ways competing with or forms the two mainstream ceramic traditions of the new dynasty, that is the Joseon dynasty, and the other ceramic tradition being white porcelain. Now, porcelain, of course, becomes an international phenomenon, say by the 17th and 18th centuries. It starts in China, as you know, and by the 15th century, it reaches Korea in the sense that Koreans produce domestic porcelain, and it becomes all the rage. Though it starts out as courtware, and by the second half of the 16th century, the court establishes and manages a manufacturing center exclusively for producing white porcelain and blue and white porcelain, that is porcelain decorated with underglaze cobalt blue. Then it shifts, of course, to Japan by the 17th century and spreads all over Europe and eventually reaching America as well. So porcelain is a worldwide phenomenon. And there is, in fact, internationally, a shift toward making and demanding porcelain that Korea participates in. And it is in this environment that Buncheong is also produced. And it is because of demand for porcelain within Korea that Buncheong basically dies out in the 16th century. But as you can see, there are shared traits in terms of the forms of vessels. On your right is an example of early Joseon, that is 15th century porcelain, and on your left is the same Buncheong ware that you had looked at. But whereas porcelain embodies sort of philosophies of excellence and purity and refinement, Buncheong is much more experimental, much more earthy, rustic, in some ways much more dynamic. And that is the aesthetic of Buncheong. So I want to return to technique, because that is one of the main sort of features of Buncheong, one of the main ways that you can understand Buncheong. So we talked about inlay and stamp decoration. And those are the earliest forms of Buncheong. Once the court porcelain kilns are established in the second half of the 15th century, the demand for Buncheong by the elites drops. So Buncheong potters turn to more sort of local, regional consumers, and in many ways it frees them up in terms of the technique, the decoration, the design, and they become much more experimental, embracing different kinds of techniques as well as decorative motifs. This is one such example. This was made by, after forming the vessel on the wheel, the entire vessel is covered in white slip. It's brushed on with a very large brush, and you can see the brush marks here, you see on the vessel itself. After which the design, so the trees and this funny-looking bird, and the designs here are incised through the slip, and then parts of the background area is carved away. The white slip is scraped away in a technique known as sgraffito. So this combines the incising and sgraffito techniques, which were prevalent in the second half of the 15th century, particularly in the south, central, and southwestern regions of Korea. I just wanted to show the backside of this. So if you, oops, let's try that again. Actually, we did a 360, we took a 360 photograph of this object, and if you do the 360, it actually looks like the bird is running. It's very funny. And you notice with this bird, I mean, there's a certain sort of sophisticated awkwardness, shall we say, in the design. There's a certain childlike quality in many of the motifs that is very particular to Buncheong, and that is, I think, one of its greatest appeals, particularly for contemporary viewers, because it has that sort of very sort of current, very almost modern aesthetic. A map just to quickly situate you and to explain that the capital of Korea at that time in Joseon in the 15th and 16th centuries, known as Han Jung, is today's Seoul. And Buncheong was produced all over the peninsula, though primarily large parts of the production centers were concentrated in the south, west, and east. And a couple of the major kiln centers, there's one down here, which was operated from the beginning of the 15th through the end of the 15th century. And the next object that I'm going to talk about was produced primarily here at a kiln site known as Hakbongni in the central western part of Korea. which is this Buncheong with iron painted design, which is among the most popular and better known types of Buncheong today. But actually, at the time of its production, that is the late 15th through the early part of the 16th century, it comprised really a very small percentage of the total output of Buncheong. But because of its very vibrant and enticing appearance, and because much of the design on iron-painted Buncheong tend to be abstract, they're very appealing to contemporary viewers. Now, this is the only type of Buncheong where the design is in fact painted. So white slip brushed onto the surface, and then a iron oxide pigment is brushed on or painted onto the surface. Towards the end of Buncheong's life, so we're turning end of 15th and into the 16th century, the potters in fact dispense with other forms of embellishment or ornamentation and really concentrate on the white slip. Comes down to the most elemental aspects of this kind of ceramic. So here's a bottle produced at the end of the 15th into the early 16th century, where the design itself is the white slip, the brushed on white slip. And really in person, you can't beat this piece. It's so appealing. It's just absolutely delicious. And the tactile quality that's created by the brushwork on the slip. Sometimes they can't even be bothered with the brush. They take the entire vessel and just dunk it into the white slip in a technique known as dipped white slip. And here's one example where you can see the contrast between the creamy whiteness and the dark surface of the clay. In many ways, these last categories of Buncheong are directly referencing to white porcelain and also acting as a foil and as a more economic alternative to porcelain. And as I alluded to before, because of the overwhelming demand for porcelain, by the early 16th century, it is no longer just produced near the capital for the court. Anyone wants porcelain, and even the regional provincial kilns are producing them. They're, of course, different grades. They're not the pristine white that the court gets. But because of this shift in demand and production, Buncheong slowly begins to die out on the Korean Peninsula. What kinds of vessels were produced? And let's remember that Buncheong ware, as ceramics, were made to be used. They were not produced as art per se, that is to be placed on a shelf and looked at only. All of them were meant to be used, whether as daily tableware for storage, that is storage of foods, or as special sort of ritual or ceremonial vessels. Now, a good number of Buncheong that was produced in the 15th and 16th centuries were mundane vessels, dishes, bowls, and such. Here's one example, but I'll tell you why this one's special. You'll see in the center, there we go, an enlargement of the center. This is a stamp decorated Buncheong, and as you can see, it's the chrysanthemum flowers that's been stamped onto the entire surface and then brushed on with white slip. But the flowers have kind of disintegrated to the point where they're almost not recognizable. In the very center are two characters here. I keep forgetting this is not a laser beam. I'm going to circle down here. Two characters spelling Nesom. They are Chinese characters. I'll come back to that in a moment. Nesom is the name of a government bureau that operated during this time and in the first half of the 15th century particularly. So in the beginning of Buncheong's life, before porcelain was actively produced by the court, the central government levied taxes on the provinces, and ceramics was one form of tax that was presented to the court and the government. And to keep track of these, and also for quality control, they insisted that names of government bureaus be inscribed or stamped onto the vessels themselves so that they can know where they were destined for. And so we have this very physical evidence of their uses, the ultimate destination for these pieces. Some of the vessels, in fact, have both the name of the region, that is where they were produced, and the name of the government bureaus, where they were destined for. So there are these visual clues. And this is also another evidence that Buncheong, in fact, contrary to popular belief today, did not start out as ceramics for the masses. there's this very sort of simple dichotomy: porcelain, elite ware; Buncheong, ceramics for the masses. That does become true at a certain stage after the mid-15th century. But initially, Buncheong, in fact, was produced to supply the court for the most part. Other kinds of vessels. Here's an example of a large jar, beautiful sort of rounded shoulders tapering at the base with a high neck, with an inlaid peony design all over white slip, quintessential first half of 15th century Buncheong. From documents, we know that jars like this, perhaps not necessarily this particular one, but possibly, were used as flower vases at the court at various sort of banquets or celebratory events. Then there are rather more unusual vessels, like this elephant-shaped ritual vessel. It's just a darling. It's fairly large, about this big. And though it seems very unusual, quirky, and unique, in fact, it's based on a very long ancient tradition. Elephant ritual vessels were produced as metalware and bronzes from ancient times in China and also in Korea. And here's an example, a page from a document known as 국조 오래의, which means the 5 rights of the state. Rights, R-I-T-E-S, not R-I-G-H-T. So it's a manual prescribing the proper ways of observing various Confucian rites and various sort of state-level functions, all the way down to the proper sort of types of vessels and proper placements of them. And here we have an illustration of an elephant-shaped vessel that is very much like the Buncheong ware. What's unusual about the ceramic form is that it's unusual to make something in Buncheong form, vessels that were intended for state use. So we're assuming that the Buncheong vessel was probably made in the regions and the provinces, not for state use, but for probably private sort of ancestral worships or ceremonies as such. But you can see the long sort of line of tradition that this kind of quirky vessel comes from. Now let's turn to designs, the motifs, which is another sort of defining quality of Buncheong. The decorative motifs or designs on Buncheong ware, many of it actually derives, again, from earlier traditions from various media, including celadons, metalware, inlaid lacquer, and so forth. And there's a wide range from various flora and fauna, including classic Asian flowers like the peony, lotus, and of course the quintessential Asian beast, the dragon. But what happens on Buncheong is, on your right is an example of a 15th century blue and white, that is white porcelain painted with underglazed cobalt blue with a dragon that is ultimately derived from Ming prototypes from ceramics. As you know, the dragon is an auspicious and sort of magnificent beast, but not necessarily a hostile beast in the Asian tradition. Nonetheless, most dragons, particularly on porcelains, tend to have this presence, this majestic presence. But on Buncheong, they become extremely witty and humorous characters. And here we have a dragon in transformation, what I call a dragon fish, where the head retains the snout, somewhat ferocious looking or attempting to look ferocious face, and yet the body has transformed into a fish all the way down to the tail. So these touches of humor and wit are very much an essential quality of Buncheong ware that sets it apart from other kinds of ceramics. And then, as I mentioned earlier, flowers like the peony, rendered in many different fashions, as I'll show you in the next slide. Here's an example of an iron-painted bottle, Buncheong ware bottle with peony design, where the flower is not what we would call a realistic depiction, but the outlines, the shapes are distilled down to the most sort of simple elemental forms, almost like paper cutout designs, and it's extremely vibrant and dynamic. Here are different examples of peonies rendered on various Buncheong ware, the one that you just looked at, including buds of Buncheong, an exuberant, almost overflowing flower in the wild, very kind of demure peony. And here in the center, we have, when you look at it, unless I told you it was a peony, you probably wouldn't have recognized it as such. It sort of breaks down features of the flower. The dotted parts probably refers to the blossom itself, and here's this very beautiful rendering of the leaf. Again, distilled down to its most elemental, basic forms to create this very modern, abstract decoration. Talking about abstract or ambiguous designs, there are some on Buncheong that can only be described as being ambiguous or abstract, like this one. In previous publications, this has been referred to as Buncheong with lotus or pond design, open to interpretation. And so with this exhibition, we decided to just call it an abstract design. And indeed, it's all about the lines and, sort of ambiguous shapes, almost childlike in their quality. Reminds me personally of works by Miro, perhaps Paul Klee, that sort of recalls modern paintings or drawings by these artists who are associated with rather sort of sophisticated but childlike illustrations. And so one of the greatest appeals of Buncheong to 21st century viewers and art lovers is exactly this quality, that though it was made some 400 or 500 years ago, it's incredibly fresh, refreshing, and in tune with our contemporary tastes. Now, as I explained earlier, Buncheong completely dies out on the Korean peninsula by the second half of the 16th century. However, contemporaneous to its life in Korea, there's a parallel life in the neighboring country of Japan. And I'm bringing the example on the right is a Buncheong deep dish that was made in the 15th century. Again, there are two characters, Yebin, which is the name of a government, again, to which it was destined. This was probably made in the second half of the 15th century. And it was taken, at some point, taken to Japan, that is imported either officially or unofficially. It now resides in the Tokugawa Art Museum collection in Japan and has been used, passed down from within generations, has been used as a tea bowl in the Japanese context, and I'll elaborate a little bit further. The example on the left is a Buncheong dipped in white slip with no further ornamentation. The last stage of Buncheong, in many ways, one might see it as part of the decline of Buncheong if we were to look at it in a linear historical art history. But in other ways, perhaps incredibly evocative because it is so simple. And in fact, this is the kind of ceramics, Buncheong, that was very much favored in neighboring Japan. By the 16th century, in Japan, we're going to shift now geographically. We've looked at the Buncheong tradition as it developed and its unique qualities within Korea during the 15th and 16th centuries. We're going to shift to Japan and see what happens there, because there's a parallel history occurring during the 15th and 16th centuries, and also an afterlife, what I call an afterlife of Buncheong, post-16th century. In Japan, and we're going to talk specifically within the context of the tea ceremony, as many of you who know Japan know that the tea ceremony is a very big cultural phenomenon, developed over many centuries, but by the 16th century had become this very sort of codified, ritualized ceremony that then also becomes ingrained in the broader culture within Japan. And there's also an aesthetic shift within the tea ceremony, which translates in terms of actual vessels that were used into preferences for things that are imperfect, things that are more rustic, more earthy. And it's within this context that Korean Buncheong ware and other regional wares from Korea were imported to Japan and treasured, used, collected by tea connoisseurs. And at the same time, various domestic ceramic industries were started which favored that aesthetic of imperfection. Now, here are two very interesting examples. On your left is a tea bowl with a name known as Mishima Oke. Because tea vessels were so revered and because it was part of this very, initially part of an elite culture and became so much a part of the national consciousness, many tea utensils, particularly tea bowls, have names like Jennifer and Soyoung, but not like that. But they've given individual names, and such is the case with the bowl on the left. Also, currently in the Tokugawa Art Museum collection in Japan, this has a pedigree. It comes with a letter by a tea master, a sensei, which claims that this tea bowl was in the collection of a disciple of one of the most famous tea masters, Rikyu, and in fact claims that it was once owned by Rikyu himself, which traces it back all the way to at least the second half of the 16th century. I think now that you've looked at some examples of Buncheong, you recognize, it's in the Buncheong style. It's white slip, it has stamped chrysanthemum decoration and inlaid decoration. However, this is not a Buncheong per se. It's actually a Buncheong style ceramic that was made post Buncheong's life. So Buncheong more or less died out sometime in the second half of the 16th century. Bowls and vessels like these were made, harking back to the Buncheong tradition, specifically for the Japanese market. We wouldn't call them export ware because it was a very sort of small select group. But clearly, there was this consciousness of the Buncheong tradition that the Japanese favored and then looked back to Korean potters to produce them and bring them back to Japan. The bowl on the right is a tea bowl in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. When it first came into the museum in 1893, it was called Karatsu ware, a type of very well-known Japanese ware. However, in putting together this exhibition, we've looked at it and sort of reassessed and feel that it's more likely to be an early 17th century Korean product, again, made for Japanese clientele. So it was not made to be used in Korea. It is not a Buncheong per se because it was made in the early 17th century, but very much in the Buncheong idiom. I just wanted to bring up chrysanthemum decorations. The one that just popped up is from a 15th century Buncheong, and the one that just popped up now is also another bowl from 15th century Buncheong. So you can see the conscious references, and yet at the same time, these tea bowls that were made later in the late 16th or early 17th century have a certain sort of self-consciousness about them in their style and aesthetic that separates them from the earlier tradition. But you can see how there's this both a parallel development in Japan with earlier Buncheong wares being imported and used as tea bowls, and then even into the 17th century, Japanese clientele made to order tea bowls specifically in the Buncheong style. So the tradition is kept alive in the neighboring country. And I bring up this map just to point out the end of the 16th century. So again, after Buncheong has more or less died out on the Korean peninsula, there's an invasion of Korea by the Japanese in 1592, between 1592 and 1598, at the very end of the 16th century, led by the famous warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who of course is credited with unifying Japan at that time and had very grand visions of conquering all of East Asia. His final goal was Ming China. How ambitious was that? Unfortunately, he died prematurely, so he never got there. But they did invade Korea and then had to, of course, retreat before they completed the mission. But the result of this invasion, this incredibly sort of devastating war for Korea, was that a huge number of potters, other types of artisans, laborers, skilled and unskilled, were taken back to Japan by the daimyos or the warlords that were leading the various segments of the invasion. So you can see here is Japan, and they're taking the route from Japan through up like that, many of them residing in the southern provinces of Korea. And so they were transplanted to Japan Well, many of them on the island of Kyushu, which is, of course, geographically closest to Korea. And indeed, these transplanted Korean potters helped either to start or expand major ceramic industries within Japan, particularly in Kyushu. And I am now going to look at three specific wares. One, Karatsu ware. They're all concentrated here in northern Kyushu. Another one called Utsutsugawa, a pretty name. And then another one known as Yatsushiro, middle of Kyushu. And I'll also talk about some ceramics that were produced in Kyoto. We're talking now about the time period of Edo between the 17th century and the 19th century, and what I call the afterlife of Buncheong. Here's one example. So it isn't that Korean potters were taken to Japan and they just recreate what had been produced in Korea. Not at all. In fact, there is a certain time lag. And when they go using very different raw materials, clays and so forth, in a different environment, not just physical, but socioeconomic, of course they produce ceramics that are in the Japanese mode. But it's interesting that there are these pockets of what I call revivals of Buncheong from the 17th through the 19th century. And this is one prime example, known as Karatsu ware. Today, among academics, more sort of preferred term is Hizen stoneware. In the northern Kyushu, it's one of the major ceramics developed in the 16th, at the end of the 16th and into the 17th centuries in Japan. One of the top tea wares, domestic wares in Japan. As you can see, the brushed white slip on the body, contrasting with the dark clay. But the further ornamentation, the pine tree is uniquely Japanese. It's not a decoration that you find much, if at all, on Korean ceramics, including on Buncheong ware. And the pine was done with by iron oxide painting and copper green glaze, all under another layer of clear glaze. Now, the copper green is very interesting. It's something you don't really find on Korean ceramics, at least until the late 19th century or so, but it is a decorative mode within Japanese art that is popularly used. And prior to, this dates to about mid-17th century. The end of the 16th and into the early 17th century, there was a very famous ceramic ware known as oribe, which made use of the copper green glaze and was very famous for that. So this is, in many ways, an example of amalgam of an earlier Korean tradition, that is Buncheong, the method of white slip, combined with a slightly earlier popular Japanese ceramic of oribe ware, of using the copper green. And a very interesting, sort of vibrant design. The one side shows the entire pine tree contorted body, and the other side has a much more abstract design. Just wanted to compare the Karatsu ware that uses white slip brushed white slip base, but a very different aesthetic and different design, with an earlier end of 15th century Buncheong jar that also has covered the surface with white slip and has an iron painted design, but a completely different aesthetic. Here's another genre or category of Japanese ceramics known as Utsutsugawa. It's a very pretty name. When I was producing the catalog that goes with this exhibition, my colleagues in editorial, my editor and my production manager, they loved that name, to say Utsutsugawa. It's very has a very sort of nice ring to it. It's a relatively lesser known category of ceramics within Japanese art history, very particular genre, in fact. In 1691, almost 100 years after Hideyoshi's invasion of Japan, after the Korean potters were transplanted en masse to Japan, in the town of Utsutsugawa is opened a new kiln, which operates for about 60 years through the 18th century. And this is a typical example of Utsutsugawa ware, which is incredibly finely potted. So unlike Buncheong and unlike most stoneware, in fact, it's closer to porcelain in the way that it's conceived. It's extremely fine-bodied and thin-walled. It's just that the clay is very dark, and so it doesn't look like porcelain in that way. But in fact, one of the potters who started the kiln is presumed to have come from family of potters who were producing porcelain in the town of Arita. But again, the use of white slip, but in very creative, very different way from Buncheong. These puffs of clouds, here's the interior, and then the use of blue to make these designs. Here are the ginkgo leaves. Then, so we've come 17th, 18th. In the 19th century, there are these, in 19th century in general, within the Japanese culture, and particularly in tea ceremony, there are antiquarian sort of predilections or preferences, looking back to earlier traditions, both domestically and traditions that were imported into Japan. This is an example of Yatsushiro ware, which is another Kyushu ceramic genre that was in fact begun in the 17th century by a potter, a transplanted Korean potter who had settled elsewhere in Kyushu and was making another type of ceramic, then moved to Yatsushiro later in the 17th century and started out this new ceramic genre. By the 19th century, the style becomes extremely streamlined, very sort of simplified. But here's an example of inlaid stoneware, again using the white slip with the inlaid technique that harks back to earlier Buncheong ware, much like this bowl, which of course is, rather than inlaid, was stamped. So the entire surface is covered in white. Again, a slightly different aesthetic. Here's another example of 19th century Yatsushiro ware with a peony design, also inlaid. Now, surprisingly, peony, even though it's a classic Asian flower, doesn't really appear on Japanese ceramics as much as it does in, for example, Korean Buncheong ware. And because the daimyo of the warlord who was the leading figure within the Yatsushiro area was an enthusiastic tea participant, we know that he sort of had a collection, and so it seems quite probable that these potters would have seen earlier Buncheong ware or perhaps reproductions of those earlier Buncheong ware. And so it seems to me, particularly with the peony design on this particular bowl, harks directly back to the earlier tradition. Here's a detail of a Buncheong jar from the 15th century with a peony design, not to suggest that this particular one directly influenced, but there was this general awareness of this earlier Korean tradition that was still very much a part of the Japanese culture, and particularly within the tea world. So I've mentioned three very distinct, very important ceramic genres that developed in Kyushu, nearest to Korea. But in fact, during the Edo, outside of Kyushu, even in Kyoto, which was the ancient capital of Japan and has a long ceramic tradition in areas in and around Kyoto, by potters that had nothing to do with Korea. That is, they're not descendants of Korean potters, they didn't travel to Korea. But because by this time, by the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a general awareness and very much an appreciation of antique Korean ceramics, even potters in Kyoto were producing inlaid stoneware that harks back to the Buncheong tradition. On your left is a tea bowl with an inlaid crane. Well, the body is inlaid. The black parts are ion painted. Standing cranes, one on either side. That was made by Kiyomizu Rokubei 1, because there's 2 and 3 and so forth. It's a whole line of a lineage of potters who was active in the 18th century. This is an interesting example because not only does it tangentially hark back to Buncheong, but even actually to an earlier tradition. More directly, there were tea bowls almost exactly like it that were made, that is the example on your right, that were made in Korea between 1649 and about the mid-18th century, specifically by order from Japan. So specifically for export to Japan, there were a whole category of ceramics that were made in Korea, in the southeastern part, in a town known as Busan, which is a major port city. And so these wares, which then themselves refer back to an earlier tradition, not only of Buncheong, but all the way, in fact, back to Celadon, where you first see cranes, flying cranes, inlaid flying cranes, leap through generations and boundaries into Japan, to be made by a potter like Kiyomizu Rokube in the 18th century, who literally leaves his mark in this long lineage. There's a seal stamped on the base of the tea bowl on your left. Having traversed Japan through the Edo period, 17th through the 19th century, these pockets of revivals, reinterpretations of earlier Buncheong modes or idioms, in many ways the Buncheong tradition is kept alive in Japan, whereas on the Korean peninsula it had died out. And this continues with modern and contemporary potters. In Japan, to start with, on your left is a work from the 80s by a rather unusual ceramist. He was actually the son of a living national treasure, a designated living national treasure, who worked with porcelain. The son himself branched out to different types and media, and at one point became enamored of Buncheong ware. He first learned about Buncheong through collections in the West, in Europe and the US, and then he visited Korea and learned the techniques of Buncheong in the 70s and 80s. And this is his interpretation on your left. Stamped decoration with black glaze, which of course is an entirely new interpretation because you don't find that in Buncheong. So it definitely self-consciously refers back to a very specific technique and tradition, that of stamp decorating in Buncheong, but is very much a very personalized and very contemporary reinterpretation. And on your right is Tsujimura Shiro, who's one of the giants of contemporary pottery in Japan today, who has a wide-ranging repertoire, one of which is the white slip, particularly the vessel entirely dipped in white slip that he recreates with these sake bottles and tea bowls and so forth. Having lost the tradition of Buncheong, shall we say, on the Korean peninsula, Korean ceramists in the 20th century, post-Korean War, discover the tradition of Buncheong, ironically through Japan. Many of the potters starting out in 1950s, 60s, 70s went to Japan to study. This particular potter, Yoon Kwang-jo, began in the 60s and 70s, and he told me that when he was first starting out, particularly in the 70s, most Korean potters were, because they studied in Japan, doing Japanese-style pots. And when he himself discovered Buncheong ware, decided that he wanted to go back to this tradition and give his interpretations of the early tradition of Buncheong. And so he was rather unique during that time in the 70s when he started out, and he's throughout his long career dedicated himself to sort of reinterpreting the white slip mode. And here are two examples. On the left is from the 90s, where he's abandoned the wheel, the potter's wheel, and he hand forms slabs. And so his vessels are somewhat sculptural, and then making use of the incised or carved technique draws these very personalized designs that in fact refer to the area he lives, the valleys and the clouds and the mountains and so forth. On the right, the piece on the right is in fact a recent acquisition by the Metropolitan Museum. This was made in 2007. It's titled Chaos. He told me it's the moment before birth, the moment of sort of chaos right before birth. And he now experiments with white slip, the potentials and possibilities of the white slip, where he drips it all over the surface and experiments with the various ways in which white slip can be interpreted. This is a work by a younger artist, Han Jung, also Korean, who was trained both as a potter and a sculpture artist. And so his works, many of them tend to be very large, tend to be sculptural. This is a more vessel-shaped work, but is very large, in fact. Ironically, though he's very contemporary in his interpretations, he actually works in very traditional methods. So he lives just outside of Seoul, uses local clays, works, with the wheel, with his hands, very much involved in the process. He's not a large workshop employing assistants where he's just the designer. He fires in a wood-burning kiln to create vessels like this that obviously makes use of the white slip covered over the entire surface of the vessel, over which he applies a ash-based glaze that, when fired, depending on its positions, partially turns into these different vibrant colors, which you do not find in Buncheong, but is his very contemporary interpretation. And so a tradition that began in the late 14th century, evolving out of an earlier tradition, that of inlaid celadon, and develops and flourishes for just under 200 years on the Korean peninsula, developing into this very distinctive genre of ceramics that is distinctive not only within Korean art history, but also within world ceramics. Disappears on the Korean peninsula by the second half of the 16th century, wiped out for about 300 years, has a parallel alternative afterlife in neighboring Japan, as you saw through these revivals, reinterpretations, and is continued in the modern and 21st century with ceramists and potters who are very interested in not only learning more and recreating the earlier tradition, but then branching out to rise to the challenge of reinterpreting an ancient tradition in ways that are very much current to today's art lovers and viewers. And so indeed, very much an enduring, long-lasting tradition. Thank you very much.